Hi, this is a tips video about how to set your team up to give yourself a better chance to get a result if somebody plays against your AI. Now this isn't really for prolonged absences from the game. This is just simply if you have a match and you want to give yourself a better chance to get a result in that match, what you can do to set your team up to enable that to happen. Now for us, we apply these tips and have our default formation set up this way, so if at any given time we can't be online for a match, then we're okay and set up for that. And then what we do is, if we're online for the match, which we are most of the time, we then change it just before we start every match. So by default, we're set up if somebody plays against our AI, but if we are online, we then quickly make some changes. So this looks like what we would typically change it to. Now, what it should be to start with, it looks different. So the first thing is to make sure that you have an appropriate substitutes bench. So if you're online for a match, what you typically be looking for in a substitutes bench is some players that give you some cover, obviously for injuries and things like that, but also you want tactical flexibility to be able to go more defensive, to change things up, to chase a lead, to hold a lead, to adapt to different game states and changes. And the bench that we have is pretty reasonable. We've got a centre half that can also play wing back. We've got a starting player who can play wing back, so we can shift to play wing backs if we want. We can bring on a holding midfielder if we want. We can play two up front. We've got another striker if we want. And we can pretty much keep our tactic largely very similar to ours going, but just because we don't have a left back on the bench, but we do have a left wing back that can come in, but also our right back can also play left back, so we can bring the right back on and switch the player over. So if we're online, our bench can do a job for us, that's fine. But the issue is if we're offline, all the AI will do if you get a player injured is it will just substitute on another player in that exact position. So what you want in your substitutes bench is the ability to cover every single position with a substitute who can play that position naturally, basically. He's completely proficient in the position. So a better substitutes bench for us would be one that looks like, for starters, this striker. He can play left wing as well, and left back and striker. Now this could be a bad thing because the AI will typically pick the best player as opposed to the player that you would want to play that position. So it might be the case that if our left back gets injured, even though this player is a lot better at attacking, he might end up getting put into left back. So we just need to keep that in mind. So he might not be the best option, so we can review that one at the end. This player can play both wings, and we like him to play both wings. That's great. We don't want a holding midfielder on the bench because we don't have a holding midfielder in the tactic. So we want somebody who can play attacking midfield. And this player is a good option because he can play striker and attacking midfield. So that's fine. We need a central midfielder, so we can keep one on there. And basically, we need, if we imagine for a second that we don't want this player to play left back, so he could be a bad option for the bench. So we might want to force the AI to pick a proper left back if that happens. So we might want this player, better left back. But now we don't have a centre half on the bench, so we want that covered as well. So this player can play centre half and right back. So this is probably a much better substitutes bench in that. And again, if we don't, this player we typically would want playing striker actually, not attacking midfielder. So we might want this player to be the attacking midfielder. So this is a good bench in that whoever gets injured, it doesn't matter. We have a player that can come on that can play that position. And not only that, the player that the AI selects to come on, Daly is a better player than Myers. So the AI will pick Daly if the left wing gets injured as opposed to Myers. So that's what we would want. And in all other instances, there's no clashing, there's no overlap. There's only one possible option that can pick. If there's a striker injured, there's only one striker on the bench. If the central attacking midfielder is injured, there's only one attacking midfielder on the bench. There's only one player who can cover central midfield. There's only one player who can play centre half, one player who can play right back, one player who can play left back. So the only clash is left wing. And worst case scenario is it brings on Myers instead, and it's not the end of the world. He can do a job on left wing anyway. So this is a pretty good substitutes bench if you're not going to be online for a match, because no matter what happens, the AI isn't going to do anything that's going to be too suboptimal there in regards to the auto change that it will do. So this is the first big tip. Make sure that you've got your substitutes bench sorted out. The next tip is making sure that your starting 11 is sorted out. Now, broadly speaking, what does this mean? This means don't start any players pretty much who have less than 100% condition, because you won't be able to sub them off during the match. Now, there might be an exception here if they have 99% or 98% or something, but if they have like 90% condition, unless they're a superstar type player, if they're just a normal player, you probably don't want to start them, because you can't bring on a fresh player for them in the latter stages of the match when they're going to be tiring for sure. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then another thing to keep in mind, just as an extension to this, is that any players who have really sort of low endurance, they are potentially going to struggle to play out the full match, and they're going to not be that strong at the end. It's okay if you play such players. It's just something you need to keep in mind. I think it's fine if the players are really good, and particularly if there's just one or two of them. But if you have a whole team of players like that, it can really give an upper hand to your opponent that they can exploit if they're online for the match. When it gets to the latter stages of the match, when your team is tiring and theirs is less tired, and they can bring substitutes on and change stuff around, they can really take advantage of that position. So it's just something to bear in mind here, that low endurance players are worse if you're not online, basically, and higher endurance players are better if you're online. I mean, typically speaking, obviously it's better to have high endurance players anyway, but the negatives of the low endurance players can be somewhat offset if you're online, because you can sub them off and you can have them on the bench to make sure they come on and have an impact and things like that. So it's just something to keep in mind, just a factor. So the other thing is the team instructions. Now, the big ones here that you're going to care about, we'll have a separate video that discusses slider settings and trying to get the most out of your team and players to suit tactics and tactics to suit teams, and do a video on that. That'll be a longer one to try and give some tips there. But this is just tips about if you're not going to be online for the match, what are the things that you're going to care about. So the first one to keep in mind is the aggressiveness slider. Now, if you're not online and it's more aggressive, you have more chance basically to get yellow cards, injuries, knocks, red cards, and you kind of have more chance to injure your opponent, things like that as well. So what does that mean? That means that if you are more aggressive, you have more chance to get one of your players pick up a knock, and you won't be online to sub them off. So aggressiveness is something that punishes you potentially if you're not online. Aggressiveness, high aggressiveness is something that can be better negated, better worked around if you're online for a match because of the knocks. You won't be able to be on to sub the player off, and a yellow card. You won't be on to sub them off if they've got a yellow card. Warning, they've got a yellow card and a warning. They're on the brink of being sent off potentially, but you won't be there to sub them off, and you won't be there to turn the tackling slider down to be more cautious as well if you happen to have a few players with yellow cards. So you can't basically mitigate cards, you can't mitigate knocks, you can't mitigate the risks that come with having the high aggressiveness. So it's just something that you need to bear in mind here. It's generally a bad idea to have it all the way up. It's possible that you might want to, but just generally a bad idea. It depends on many factors. This is just something to keep in mind. So you might not want to have that as high if you're not online. The next one is the closing down slider. And this is in the same vein, in that if you press, your players will tire more quickly. And because you're not online to sub them off, it becomes something that is hard to mitigate. That you can't mitigate it. So if you're online, you can press more, and you can have some of your players getting really tired, and you can sub them off for fresh players, and you can somewhat mitigate the effects of the pressing because you're online and because you can make the subs. If you're not online, you can't do that, and you can't basically mitigate the main downside of pressing, which is that your players get tired. So you can't do anything to mitigate it. So whereas if you are backing off, your players will have sort of higher energy levels towards the end of the match, and you will be less exploitable at the end of the match. If your opponent is online and you are offline, and they can see that you are pressing and they are got some savviness about them, they will know that your team is going to be tired in the second half. They'll know they'll be able to exploit you then, and they will plan accordingly to make sure that can happen. If you are backing off, they can't rely on that advantage. The second half advantage won't be so big for them. They'll still get an advantage potentially if they play their cards right. It's all situational, but it's much harder. You can't rely on it. It's not a guarantee, basically. So, but conversely, backing off can result in your team getting outplayed early in the match, conceding early goals and things like that. So it's just something to bear in mind. Not necessarily you want it to be backing off. Sometimes just 1 or 2 or 3 notches. I'd sort of recommend anywhere between full backing off and halfway, but not over halfway. It's too easy to exploit your team. I'm going to say if you are going to go beyond halfway, you just want to do 1 notch beyond halfway. And the reason for that is because, and another great thing to be aware of, especially if you're not going to be online, and this is generally for everything, is that if you're in this range, your opponent doesn't know. They don't get any information that you are pressing or that you are backing off. So they don't know that you're kind of pressing them a bit, and they don't know that you're kind of backing off a bit. So you provide them with less information for them to work with. So if you're going to want to press, then this is the correct setting if you're not going to be online for the fixture, because you're not giving that information to them. And that means at the beginning of the match, they're not going to know they're going to have that big advantage in the second half. As the match progresses and they can see that your team is getting more tired potentially and theirs isn't, they might work it out eventually, but they're not going to know it from the very beginning. So they can't rely on that advantage, that big advantage at the end of the match from the very beginning of the match. And that can be an important factor. So, and that's a good general tip for everything, broadly speaking, that if you have the sliders in this range, the opposition doesn't get any information to work with. I'm going to do a separate video on what these sliders mean, and that, it's in the game guide, but we'll go into more details and some practical examples and stuff in another video. But just broadly speaking, if you have them in these middle 3 range, you're denying your opponent information, and for some opponents that won't make any difference because they don't use it, but for some it will make a difference. So the big ones that you care about for this, what we're talking about, is the closing down. Like we said, you basically want it anywhere in this range. And the aggressiveness, you want it basically anywhere in this range. So the main other thing to care about is the mentality slider. Now, anything is okay, really, just not defensive, not all out defensive. You don't want it all out defensive, pretty much. And the reason for that, there could be some rare exceptions, like if you happen to be playing against a really good team and your team's really, at the bottom of the table. If you're in a relegation dogfight and you're happy to potentially get draws and not really win, then that's okay. But the main downside of this, under all normal circumstances, is that if your opponent gets a lead against you and your team is set up ultra defensive, then they basically won the game if they're smart, because they can just set themselves up to be ultra defensive. You've got 2 teams on the pitch that are set up ultra defensive. It's pretty easy in relative terms for them to hold a lead, especially a multiple goal lead. If you're set up defensive and they get a goal or 2 goals, they've basically won the match. They don't have to do anything other than just set up defensive, and your team is just going to sit back, they're going to sit back, and they'll just win. Whereas, of course, if you happen to get the early goal playing defensive, then you're naturally set up to defend it. But the difference here really is that if they get the early goal, they will pretty much just win. If you get the early goal, you're set up to defend it, but they could still go more attacking, still score and still change stuff. So you just don't want to go ultra defensive. A bit defensive is fine, you just don't want to go too defensive. And you don't necessarily want to go too attacking. You just want to make sure that if your opponent gets the lead against you, they can't easily just win the match because they happen to score first. That's basically all you're looking for here. And the only other one, to a lesser degree, is just the tempo, especially sort of slower tempo, and is the big one really. Especially if you're defensive and slower tempo, it's like you're trying to slow the whole match down and you're playing ultra defensive. So if they happen to get an early lead against you and they do the same, they're probably just going to win. It's less of a deal than the mentality ultra defensive, but it plays into the same vein. You just don't want to make it easy for them to just close you out and win the match just because they happen to score first. So you don't necessarily want fast tempo. You just want anything other than slow. And even slow is okay to a degree, as long as you don't have too defensive a mentality. So it's just something, of all the factors here, this is the least important one that we discussed really. What you don't want is ultra defensive and slow in combination if you're not going to be online. It's too easy to close you out of the match. It's too easy to beat you if the opponent happens to score a goal first. So hopefully these tips were useful to set your team up in order to give you a better chance to get a result if you're not online for a match. Thanks very much, and we hope that you'll watch some more videos in the future about getting some more tips and improving your game. Cheers.